Hi, caregivers. My name is Megan Hargrave. I am an education coach and consultant. And one of the questions that I am asked all the time is, what about grammar? What about grammar? What about grammar? As a writing workshop teacher and somebody who supports writing workshop teaching in lots of different grade levels, one of the things that I'm constantly talking to teachers and students about is their volume and stamina. Writing a lot and writing for long periods of time. And that's just because the more that we practice something, the more that we acquire that skill, the more that we grow. And so, one of the things to keep in mind is you don't want the worry of perfect grammar and perfect conventions to get in the way of students' volume and stamina as writers. That said, it is certainly something to think about. And so I'm going to share some ideas with you of some things to consider when it comes to supporting the grammar in your students' writing. The first thing to think about is the stages of grammar acquisition. And when we think about grammar acquisition, oftentimes it can be boiled down into three different stages. The first stage is really thinking about recognition and thinking about exposure, quite frankly, to different usages of punctuation and different types of grammar really inside of the books that kids are reading. So the more that kids read, the more that they will start to recognize some of the standards when it comes to grammar and conventions. For recognition, kids live in this space for a long time. The same thing happens for me if I'm acquiring a new skill. If I'm going to learn a new language, there's a long time that I hear that language and I might hear those words and I might recognize that that's a French word and I might even recognize that it's a French food, but it's taking a lot of recognition before I start to move into the next phase, which is approximation. And we could call it approximation, or another word for this could also be thinking about practice. And when we think about approximation and practice, it doesn't happen overnight. It takes a long time. And so whether it's a grammar or convention skill or learning a language, I am going to approximate. I'm going to practice using whatever it is that I'm learning over and over again before I move into a final phase of mastery. And hopefully, a lot of approximation will lead to mastery. And so, when we look at these three phases, recognition, approximation, and mastery, as caregivers, one of the things we can support our students with is doing lots of reading, and reading where we're recognizing some of the different grammar and convention moves, some of the punctuation moves that authors are using, and expose kids to lots of different types of texts. And then the approximation phase, we really want to celebrate approximation and celebrate where kids are practicing some of the different grammar and convention skills that they have been learning both in school and out. And then remember that there are certain things that kids will take to mastery, and being mindful of what those things are and when those things are deemed appropriate. A nice example of this is thinking about when my nephew started to play around with the letter I. And it took years of my nephew reading books before he even started writing. But as he was reading books, I'm sure that he was starting to see that in many books, the letter I doesn't look like this very often. In fact, the letter I, when it's alone, looks like this over and over again in the books that I'm reading. And then at some point, at a very young age, probably kindergarten, first grade, in my nephew's writing, he started maybe playing around with this, but once in a while, he'd go ahead and put the capital I and then put the next word. And he started approximating. He started practicing on his own when to use the capital letter I when that letter stands alone. Now, at this point in his education as a fourth grader, he doesn't even think about capitalizing the letter I. He doesn't even switch back and forth between the two. He's mastered the skill, and now he capitalizes the letter I. And so when you think about supporting your learners at home, really keep in mind these two phases of recognition and approximation. Expose them to lots of reading and lots of books, and talk about the punctuation that you see. Talk about the grammar usage in the book, either something that feels correct or not correct. Why is the author using this, and what are they doing? And then remember, the more that you say, try it again, do it again, the more that kids are approximating. In a final sum up, three things to think about. The first one, as I just said, accept that approximation. Let kids practice and play. If you teach them what an ellipses are, have them play with that. And you might see all over their writing that everywhere in their writing it's dot, 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 dot. even in places that don't make sense, but celebrate that. Celebrate the fact that they are approximating. When we start to teach students complete sentences, then you have all of these short complete sentences, but they're approximating, and that's a good thing. After you, or in addition to accepting approximation, remember that you really want to look with students at grammar as a tool instead of a rule. And when a lot of us were taught, a lot of times growing up, we were taught that grammar was a rule. But then we open up any book that we read and we see that, this is a rule breaker. This doesn't follow the rule that I know. And so the more that we can really talk about grammar as a tool instead of a rule, the more that we will see writers really starting to own and master some of these different conventions, grammar, punctuation. And then last but not least, the more that you can help students or help your learners make the connection between grammar and meaning, the better. And so instead of just thinking about things in isolation, really try and get them to see those things inside of their writing. An example might be this. Instead of saying, well, that's one of those words that needs the apostrophe, talk about why there's apostrophe. Oh, we are makes sense in that sentence. And so this is one of those words that uses a W-E apostrophe R-E, so that the meaning we are is attached to the were with the apostrophe. And so as partners with your students, teachers, and with your students' schools, really think about the approximation, thinking about grammar as a tool, and making connections between grammar and meaning. Thanks so much.